It's an election year, and while the vote for presidential candidates comes up in March, ensuring election integrity continues under a 2-year-old law in Florida. Secretary of State Byrd joins us in studio discussing the impact of the Office of Election Crimes and Security, plus tracking trends and learning what voters want. That's one way that Dr. Michael Bender is making a difference at UNF, explaining the work of the Public Opinion Research Lab on This Week in Jacksonville. Thanks for being with us today. Florida Secretary of State Byrd is with us, former state representative from the beaches here in Northeast Florida. First elected to the House in 2016, and Secretary Byrd joining us. It's been a couple years almost since you replaced Laurel Lee in May of 2022. And so today we want to talk about the Office of Election Crimes and Security. It was created in the legislature just before you took the role. And then what I was interested in, you just released a report, basically the first full year that the office has been up and running. What were some of the high points there? And maybe start with what was the importance of creating that office?
Sure. Thank you. Great to be with you, Ken. And I think the importance and what I would want people to know is, our election laws are no different than any other laws. And I've been at the elections game for about a quarter century, about 25 years. And what we saw is that election laws were not being enforced. So they're on the books, but no one's enforcing them. So the governor and the legislature decided about 2 years ago that it would be important, because we are a rule of law state, that we let people know that, want you to exercise your constitutional right to vote, but we're going to do so in a lawful manner, and that people who violate the law or break it, we're going to investigate and prosecute where necessary.
Aren't there like 66 elections supervisors throughout the state of Florida
67, but yep.
Who would say, yes, 67 of them would say, wait a second, we're doing a good job with elections. And I know when this was created and when we had gone through the 2020 election, the presidential election, a lot of praise came toward Florida. Hey, handled well, whereas if you look back 20 years, maybe there was some trouble.
Right. Well, certainly, and I think the benefit that Florida has is we have the benefit of going through the 2000, the Bush v. Gore election. So we've been working at this, the legislature, improving our election laws. And we had a great election in 2020, but we didn't rest on our laurels. We looked around the country and said, what can we anticipate and what can we do better to strengthen our laws? And part of that was making sure that the laws we do have are enforced. And in fact, you mentioned the supervisors. We have a wonderful relationship with them. They do a great job. We have a great supervisor here in Jerry Holland in Duval County. Most of our referrals come from the supervisors of elections, because they're the ones who are seeing the irregularities and then reporting it to us for further investigation.
So when I look at this report from 2023, were there arrests? For what kind of charges? And because of any fraudulent activity or any improper activity, were any elections affected or overturned or anything like that?
Right. So we haven't had any elections overturned, but certainly fraud occurs. So for anybody who says that there is no fraud, it happens, and we have arrests and have gotten guilty pleas. We've gotten convictions, most of those for double voters. But now, with more experience, we're now turning to fraud in voter registration. And just this week, the FDLE arrested 2 people for petition gathering fraud on the abortion amendment that the Supreme Court this week heard oral argument on. So there are people who can change our Constitution by putting fraudulent petitions or signatures on the ballot.
Walk that out just a little bit. What is petition fraud, or what does that look like? So hey, I'm writing down fake names, or what does that mean?
Exactly. It is writing down fake names, and people put a lot of personal information on the internet, and that's one of the warnings I would want to give people. So there are people that go onto Facebook or other social media sites, and there's enough information on their dates of birth, addresses, full legal names, and they take that information and then they fraudulently put down on a petition to change our state's constitution and then turn those into the supervisor of elections. And like I said, FDLE just arrested 2 people this week on 10 counts each. So that's 20 counts of fraud, of election fraud, of hundreds of signatures that were fraudulently turned in, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are other investigations ongoing.
So I didn't print the whole report. I told you, hey, I took some of the highlights here, the executive summary of this report that came out. And one of the things that stood out is that the office was created to increase, I guess, voter confidence in election integrity. So how is that measured? How do you know if that's what's happening because of the office?
Sure. Well, I think you're giving me the opportunity to come on and talk to the people in Northeast Florida. And I think that if people know that their laws are being enforced, that our election laws are being enforced, that we have a dedicated unit that's 24/7, 365, whether it's an election year or an off year, that we're looking at our voter rolls, we're ensuring that they're as clean as they possibly can be. And then as we get into an election year, which the Super Bowl's this week, this is our Super Bowl this year in Florida. We have 3 statewide elections. When people know that there's state officials that are investigating allegations, that they will have more confidence when they go to the polls. And I am anecdotally hearing that when I go out and talk to people around the state.
And looking through this report, I wanted to ask about, there was a focus on 2022 on ineligible felon voters. And then what I saw a lot of in 2023 was a specific example would be this hard knock strategies, and there were fines there. What was that about?
Right, sure. So they are a third-party voter registration organization, and those are groups in which they have a right to, they're in state law, they have a right to go out and register people to vote. But there was a lot of confusion about Amendment 4 that passed several years ago that would allow certain felons to then have their rights restored.
If they weren't convicted on a few charges,
and
right?
if they had met their fines, fees, and obligations. But some of these groups were going out and telling anybody, hey, if you're a felon, doesn't matter, the state has restored your rights. That's inaccurate. And they were registering people to vote, and they fined them, and we have fines up to, I think it's $100,000 now in fines with these groups. So we're holding them accountable because they're acting as a fiduciary for that person that's registering to vote. I mean, we're saying we have instances where they didn't turn the voter registrations in on time. And if you don't turn them in on time, that person can't vote. You can't show up on election day and say, well, I registered with this group. If they don't turn them in, you can't vote. So that's disenfranchising people. So we're actually protecting individuals' right to vote by holding these third-party groups accountable.
And one of the things I looked at here, and we're going to run out of time before we get too far into this, but basically the office there would say you're not charging people or you're not prosecuting people. That goes to the prosecutors. How does that work?
Correct. So that's one of the, and I'm glad you bring that up because there has been a misreporting in the law that we have elections police. That is absolutely not true. At the Department of State, Office of Election Crimes, we investigate allegations, and where we find credible evidence, we then refer that to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and the statewide prosecutor or the local state attorney. So we do not have guns and badges. We investigate and then hand that off to the people who are more expert in that. So
and the relationship with those prosecuting agencies, that's something that's working well so far?
It's working well, and we're helping educate them. I mean, election laws it's a complex mix of federal and state law, and I think that's part of why you didn't have election laws being enforced, because they're inherently political. You have law enforcement that's not something they deal with every day. So we're helping educate prosecutors and law enforcement on what to look for and how to properly prosecute these claims. So we help them on the legal side.
Final word then, from your perspective, in 2024, for this general election that's coming up, should Floridians and voters feel more confident in the election that's going to happen?
Absolutely. I would tell every Floridian, we make it easy to register to vote. We make it easy to vote. We try to make it hard to cheat. And that I want people to know that when they go to the polls, their vote's going to be counted. It's going to be counted accurately. It's going to be counted timely. But don't come to Florida and play games on elections, because we'll hold you accountable.
All right. Secretary Byrd, thank you so much. Appreciate it. And a reminder to you, Florida's presidential preference primary taking place coming up March 19th. Thanks for your time today. Dr. Michael Binder is with us in just a moment. We're going to talk about the national recognition that he and UNF is receiving for the Public Opinion Research Lab. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
And joining us for the rest of our time this morning, Dr. Michael Binder from University of North Florida. You oversee the Public Opinion Research Lab. This was how we first got connected 10 or 12 or something years ago.
A few years ago.
It's been a little bit. And this is really cool. I wanted to talk to you because you've earned some national acclaim. 538 ranking UNF as the 12th best pollster in the country. What does that mean to you, and what does that recognition mean to the university?
It's a great feeling, right? To be recognized for the work that you're doing on a national scale by an organization that is so well regarded in our community, not only in the academic community, but in the public opinion world. And it's a good feeling that, the work that we're doing of being transparent, of trying to be as accurate as we can be, is getting seen.
Well, and that's kind of what I would get at. What are those factors that 538 looks at in order to come up with their rankings there?
Obviously, accuracy is number one. But a bigger part, and that is becoming more and more important in the polling world, is transparency. How clear are you about your methods, how you contacted the people, when you were in the field, what questions you do? Are you willing to share your data with nonprofits? Those types of things. And those all are important so that people can trust the data that you're giving.
How do you communicate that? And is it important on that transparency side? Is it important to have that at the front end or at the back end or all the way through the process? How does that work?
So whenever we do our public releases, and press releases come to all the local news agencies.
I see them, yes.
At the back of those, there's all the crosstabs, all the question wording, and then a really detailed methodological statement about how the data were gathered, where the phone numbers were pulled from, when we called, who we called, all that sort of thing, so that people can see, if they're curious, how this was done, when this was done, because sometimes things are done differently. Phone, web, mail, there's a variety of different ways the implications change.
The method a poll is done, does that influence answers or conclusions, that sort of thing?
It certainly can. Some folks are maybe a little more hesitant to say things if they're involved in criminal activity in a face-to-face or a phone poll. Maybe they're more likely to admit to that in an online where there's nobody actually staring at you. But also, who's going to respond? Some people are more or less likely to do it on a phone versus in an email or hitting a scan code or something like that.
Do you have to make those decisions based on the topic? That sounds like a little bit of what you're describing.
Based on the topic, based on the timeliness that you have, based on the resources that are available to you, right? Having live callers is an expensive proposition, paying our callers to be there all night as opposed to just bloop, sending out an email.
Yeah. So I want you to talk a little bit about that. So I know the Public Opinion Research Lab opened more than 20 years ago, but as I was reading, it's one of just 2 centers like it, I guess, in Florida, which have dedicated live callers in an academic survey center.
Yeah. So us and UF doesn't do any political polling really. So we're the only ones out here doing political polling with live callers on campus. And our students are a big part of that. They're making calls, they're learning. Many of them are employees getting paid. I know the political stuff is why I'm here all the time and why we're talking about this, but we do a lot of work for state agencies, other nonprofits, private organizations as well.
So as I look back at this, you took leadership in 2011 from former UNF professor Matt Corrigan, who we got to know a little bit there. I understand there's 4 staff members for the Public Opinion Research Lab.
Full-time staff members.
And so how are things different in 2024 than they were in 2011?
Night and day. When I came on in 11, Corrigan had transitioned to being chair of the department, and the lab had kind of sat floundering, and essentially the doors were closed, the lights were out. It was me.
Really?
It was me and one other graduate student, Andrew Hopkins, and we did a couple of small projects. It was us there till 10 o'clock at night with all of the callers, putting them together, and now we have, a full-time team and hundreds, plural, of callers working for us.
So you saw that darkened room, and this is what I'm getting at, Dr. Bender. What drives a pollster? What makes somebody say, "Ooh, I want to engage in this"? And obviously, you've been building this over these last several years.
I was snookered into it a little bit. I was an academic coming out of graduate school, and it was, Matt did a great job. He's like, "Hey, you can get some data for some research for this." And I said, "That sounds like a wonderful idea." A dozen years later, I'm hook, line, and sinker. And we want to be right. We want to provide valuable information. And sometimes that's the horse race stuff. That gets a lot of the attention. But the policy positions of how Floridians or maybe local Jacksonvillians feel about a particular issue, that's their opportunity to get heard that you don't always get.
When you get feedback, is it positive or negative? Is it complaints? The poll didn't show what I wanted it to show?
There's certainly that. And you didn't call me, so how is this valid? Right. We get that. I've had calls from mayors, chiefs of staff, from people that were running Senate campaigns and gubernatorial campaigns that were unhappy. But I've heard a lot of positive feedback as well out in the community, whether it's emails or people coming up to me. They like the work that we do. And we try to get it right. We try to provide fair and reasonable information to people as they can help make decisions politically.
How many many students get involved in this?
So we do class projects, and we can have a couple hundred students in a given semester.
Wow.
And our employees were, 100, 150 in the past year that worked for us that collected a paycheck at one time or another.
Yeah, well, like I said, interesting, and that's how we got connected, and really cool to see that national recognition after these last few years. So I'm not letting Dr. Binder get away. We're going to set our sights on some national political politics here. The presidential election coming up. We're going to talk about that as we look at the race for the White House. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
And political science professor Dr. Michael Binder from UNF is with us. So I wanted to talk presidential candidates and politics here. And one of the things that we're seeing is so much focus on former President Trump, who looks like he's going to be the Republican nominee for president for the third straight time. But he's got all these legal issues. And one of those things that we saw this last week is that a court rules the former president does not have presidential exemption from prosecution.
Right, and that's something that a lot of folks are excited about if you're not a Trump fan. Oh, we can get this guy for all the terrible stuff he's done. There's a long way to go before you get to that. And as we've seen with many of the other trials that have played out, courts take time, courts get delayed. Again, right, we're in February. I know the race seems like it's a long time away in November, but a month here, a month there, next thing you know, it's the end of August and we're in the height of the season and nothing's going to happen now.
Yeah, the Supreme Court was hearing arguments this past week on whether or not Mr. Trump should be on the ballot in different states. Colorado is what brought that to the Supreme Court. But just because the justices hear this case doesn't mean that they got that ruling right away. All of this takes some time. And in the meantime, I think some people are saying, well, it just puts former President Trump in the news every single day. It's free media for him.
He has no problem getting into the news and hasn't since 2015. And even before that. Having grown up in Jersey, I've used to see him because of his real estate dealings in the New York and New Jersey area. And he's good at this. He's great at this. He's untouchable. But yes, the 14th Amendment cases, whether or not states can block him from being on the ballot, I would expect that the court would actually rule on that sooner rather than later, because states, if they try to remove him from the ballot, you got to have that so that Secretary of State was here earlier. It takes time to get these ballots printed and get them mailed out and all those sorts of things.
Yeah. So do the presumptive nominees, the current sitting president, Joe Biden, and the former president who seems to be far ahead as the Republican Donald Trump, do they start a national head-to-head campaign already? We're not even through Super Tuesday. We're not through the primaries yet.
I feel like that's already been going on. Biden's been talking about Trump for a couple months, and Trump's been talking about Biden for about a year and a half now. He hasn't even addressed his Republican challengers, and it was a strategy that worked out beautifully for him. He's down to one, and I would imagine that one probably won't be around much longer after this month's over.
Well, let's talk about Nikki Haley for just a minute. She's been going after Trump on mental fitness. That's what Trump goes after Biden about, is mental fitness. And so what's the answer to the voters who say, is this the best we've got?
It's what we've got. And it's what we're going to be having for the next 9 months. And I would imagine that among the 300+ million people in this country, there are probably 2 people on each side of the aisle that are probably better candidates. But this is what we have. And there's a lot of disincentives to get involved with politics, particularly with how ugly it is and the need to raise all this money. And it prevents people from running. And that's a shame, because there's a ton of good people that could really provide answers to folks that are looking for that.
The governor of Florida raised a lot of money and ran a campaign. Tell me briefly why you think the DeSantis campaign didn't flourish, didn't go where Governor Ron DeSantis really wanted it to.
I think there's 2 problems that he faced. One, Donald Trump was still in the race, and he is the foundation of the Republican Party in 2024, and going up against that was always going to be difficult. The second part, and I think this really played out, he struggled connecting with voters. He had a likability issue and a relatability issue that he was unable to overcome. And if he's serious about doing this again in 28, he's going to need to put work in on that front. And sometimes that's hard to do. Sometimes that's an innate characteristic If you look at Donald Trump, no matter what you think of his politics, the man has charisma and he can connect to people.
He certainly says, look at me, and I'm going to talk for a little bit, regardless of what the topic is. That's what you're getting at, right?
And people will. And people get drawn into that. And you can think he's a terrible human being for a number of different reasons. But gosh darn, if he doesn't get people to at least listen and see, oh, yeah, I could see some truth in that statement, or, oh, wow, I can't believe he's saying that. There's just a likability factor there that Ron DeSantis really struggles with.
So, and as you pointed out, if there's going to be a campaign by Ron DeSantis in 4 years, part of that is because I think it's this person's turn, it's that person's turn, it's not your time, and it's things you mentioned, New Jersey. It's what we saw a dozen years ago with Chris Christie.
He missed it.
Missed it? And is that the case for Ron DeSantis before we run out of time?
I think he's got a shot to run, but I don't know that he'll be able to get the money that he got this time. He transferred a lot of money over from his gubernatorial campaign. That won't be there next time. And can he get those big money donors behind the scenes to believe in him again when he failed so spectacularly this time?
Yeah. Dr. Michael Binder, it's fun. We don't get to connect like this as often as we probably should, but thanks for spending the time, and again, congratulations on that reputational success for the Public Opinion Research Lab.
Thanks for having me, and yeah, UNF's doing some great work.
That's awesome. Thank you. All right, This Week in Jacksonville airs each Sunday morning at this time, and next time, Duval County School Board Chairman Darrell Willey joins us. I'm Kent Justice. Thanks for watching on air on Channel 4 and the CW17, and then, of course, finding us online at news4jax.com or streaming on News4Jax Plus. And as we wrap today, I want to remind you about This Week in Jacksonville Business Edition. It's a streaming podcast. We focus on economic development in the River City and our region. This week's episode looks at medical tourism. You can find new episodes every Thursday at 9 a.m., and you'll find it right now on News4Jax Plus under the channel This Week in Jacksonville.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.